Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I paused there for just a second, briefly considering just teetering on the edge. Maybe we'll just turn around and not do anything, right? Okay, well, no, it is it's not Tuesday. It's Thursday, as a matter of fact, March 9th, 2023. Thor, anytime you're ready to show up and claim the day, I guess we'll have it ready for you. Would you like it gift wrapped? Do you need a gift receipt? Is there anything we can do for you? No? Okay, great. Let's get started. I don't know. Nothing happening as far as I can tell. Another busy day here today, but I think everything should be fine with respect to getting kids to school, etc., etc. So I hope no huge worries in that respect. No emergency texts that I'm expecting today. Other things are happening and can occupy our time instead. Well, for one thing, let's see. I'm getting a bunch of those PR firm emails again, trying to ask if I want to book guests. And I guess, they have no interest and no interest in looking to see whether the people who they're emailing actually have any interest in any of these guests. I mean, these are obviously fairly conservative guests. Occasionally they do. It fools me. Every once in a while they throw somebody in who's not obviously ultra conservative weirdo. But yeah, usually anytime I get one of these guest availability emails. This one has to do with the FBI and the DOJ and their arrogant evasion of truth about corruption and abuse of power against Christians and conservatives and all of us, as a matter of fact, in case you don't count yourself among any of the first two groups. But as you know, it is their continuing belief that Christians are among the most persecuted people in the world, and certainly the most persecuted people here in the United States. As you know, it's very difficult to openly build a church here in the United States, or to profess your faith, or to wear some sort of gold symbol of your faith around your neck on a chain for everyone to see. It immediately subjects you to all sorts of inhumanities and torture, abductions, etc., obviously. It's very difficult. We only express the date here in Christian terms, 2023, of course, which means nothing to anybody else except, it's supposed to be a measurement of the time that's passed since the Christian Savior was born. And that's how we express the passage of time. But, as you know, it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to be a Christian in this country. But so we should check in with this person and see what the Department of Justice is doing to make it even worse. It's so terrible. Anyway, many other things actually happening today, and we'll get to some of those. I have an interesting pair of stories about parents organizing over their concerns about their children's education from various angles, let's say. If we can get around to it. Mother Jones profiling someone, I guess, or the activity inside, as they say in their headline, inside the secret working group that helped push anti-trans laws across the country. Whereas, on the other hand, the Washington Post features the fear and fury of these Florida parents, people who are essentially organizing the backlash against the fascist march in Florida. But it's an excellent recounting of all of the measures that Ron DeSantis himself is pushing, that conservative legislators in the Florida state legislature are pushing. I do notice now that DeSantis is trying to distance himself from some of their even more extreme measures. Whether or not he ought to be able to get away with that, I don't know. I mean, politically speaking, you ought not to let him get away with it. But it's interesting. I think the latest big one that made a big splash was the registration of bloggers idea. DeSantis, I think specifically, has said, I didn't ask for this, and I don't even necessarily support it. It's just a state legislator who thought this was a good idea. And it's a bill that happens to do an incredible personal political favor for the governor. But, of course, you may recall that they also included themselves in this bill. You're not allowed to do paid blog posts criticizing the governor, the lieutenant governor, members of the cabinet, but hey, also state legislators. So it is entirely possible that it's really about protecting themselves, and they figured if we throw the governor in, then he'll sign the thing because he'll be protected too. So it remains to be seen whether when push comes to shove, or if push will ever come to shove. We don't know whether this bill will ever get so much as a hearing in the Florida state legislature, but it's a good bet that it might. It's in fact a good bet that the thing might even pass, and they throw it to Ron DeSantis, and all right, well, we'll see whether he puts his money where his mouth is, and says, well, it's actually a bad idea, or if he was just being coy and saying, well, it wasn't my idea. I didn't say it was bad, I just didn't say it was mine. So something to watch, I guess, and to see how things develop in Florida. And let's find out how things are developing in Connecticut, or at least how things elsewhere look from the perspective of Connecticut. Greg Dworkin is here. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. So, what I want to know is what happens if shove comes to push's place of establishment first, and then, decides that they're going to take the law in their own hands, and then we have another January 6th.
Well, yeah, I mean...
And it's all DeSantis' fault.
It's norm-breaking at its best. That's true. There's no reason why shove needs to wait around for push to come to it, does it?
Right. It just people get trapped in this normie way of thinking, and I think you got to shake things up sometimes.
Right. Just because the founders never envisioned shove going to push doesn't mean it can't happen.
Well, look, what DeSantis is trying to do is look super duper conservative so he can run for the GOP nomination. And he's asking the Florida legislature, who he has in his back pocket, to do stuff for him. But, of course, once you unleash the crazy, you can't always control it. So it doesn't necessarily make him look all that great outside of Florida. I'm not sure how it makes him look inside Florida.
Yeah, it's questionable.
Yeah, it is questionable. So, the assumption is that, this is just DeSantis being the true fascist that he is. Again, you can't really be a fascist without charisma, and he has none.
Yeah, that's, you can be a boring super jerk that people should hate, rightly.
You can be an authoritarian.
Yeah, right, that's true.
But it's hard to have a cult of DeSantis when, who?
Right, and the boots are ugly,
Yeah, that won't do it, I don't think. But since you brought that up, this was in my list of things to talk about, so maybe we'll do this first, and then we'll do some interesting things that I learned. They may not be interesting, but because I didn't know them, they are to me because I learned them. Okay, but before we get to that, two polls out, which I thought were awfully interesting.
Polls out, folks.
Yeah, both awful and interesting.
I don't know what that, okay.
Nice out. So this one is from USA Today. A GOP war on woke? And you know about headlines with the question.
Oh, okay. Let me find the question mark.
The answer is always no. Most Americans view the term as a positive, USA Today Ipsos poll finds. By 56 to 39, Americans say woke means being aware of social injustice, not being overly politically correct.
Well, yeah, all right.
Of course, the correct answer is that when the GOP uses it, woke means black, but that's besides the point.
Yes.
If you're just asking normie white Americans what woke means being aware of social injustice, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, it is.
It's not a bad thing.
I'm in agreement.
That's not what the GOP wanted.
Right.
Republican presidential hopefuls are vowing to wage a war on woke, but a new USA Today Ipsos poll finds a majority of Americans are inclined to see the word as a positive attribute, not a negative one.
All right.
56% of those surveyed said the term means to be informed, educated on, and be aware of social injustice. That includes not only 3/4 of Democrats, but also more than a third of Republicans. And overall, 39% say instead that the word reflects on what has become the GOP political definition to be overly politically correct and police others' words. Yeah. That's the view of 56% of Republicans. The findings raise questions. Again, different between the primary and the general. The findings raise questions about whether Republican campaign promises to ban policies at schools and workplaces they denounce as woke could boost a contender in the party's primaries, but put them at odds with broader public opinion in the general election. Well, of course it will.
Well, all right.
Right?
Yeah.
Independents by 51-45 say woke means being aware of social injustice. And you have to remember, independents in this kind of polling are generally disaffected Republicans and tend to be conservatives, which doesn't mean that they represent the median voter that everybody should strive toward. Most of these independents have a mix of views from, to the left of Bernie Sanders to the right of Ron DeSantis, and then you mix them all together and like you're independent.
Okay. Well,
so it's not like, the gold standard is whatever pleases the independents. Not necessarily. And like gun rights, it may or may not be a voting issue. Most Americans understand that to be woke is to be tuned into injustice around us, said Cliff Young of Ipsos. But for a key segment of Republicans who make up the Trump-DeSantis base, woke is a clear trigger for the worst of the politically correct emerging multicultural majority. That's a fancy way of saying, it really means black to them.
Yes, I mean,
they actually worked that in, which is kind of cool.
They've really gone all in on trying to demonize the term, and including in one of the articles, they do have they go out of their way to make acronyms for their bills. The Florida bill is called Stop Woke, and they tried to make up something that would stand for woke, and it's a garbage acronym, but I think wrongs to our kids and employees. Okay,
Republicans by 60 to 14% say being described as woke would be an insult, not a compliment. Independents agree, 42 to 32. Democrats think it would be a compliment to say you're woke.
All right.
So about 1 in 4 say they don't know enough about what a term means to judge whether it's a compliment or a slur, and 1 in 5 don't know their own name.
Well, how'd they fill out the survey?
Well, they had some
anonymously. Oh, yeah, right. You don't want to do that. Okay, right. So it doesn't even matter.
But that's not all. This morning there's a Navigator poll out, just in case you thought that what was in Ipsos was like some kind of aberration.
Okay, like a Netscape Navigator.
Today's big takeaways: proposals to create more affordable childcare options and expand family medical leave earn overwhelming support. Banning books and AP African American history, banning that, among the most strongly opposed.
All right.
Okay. A majority of Americans say their biggest concern when it comes to education is that children will not learn the material they need to know to be successful in the future. 53%. This is the top concern of a majority of Republicans, independents, half of parents, and a plurality of Democrats. The next highest concern is split between mental health and students, lack of funding for public schools, and teachers not getting paid enough.
Okay.
When you ask them, preventing them from being exposed to woke ideas about race and gender in school, that only gets 31% support. 13% from Democrats, 22% from independents, 54% from Republicans, 33% from parents. If you're just going to hone in on like what do parents think about
the voting group.
Parents vote, so that's kind of important. But parents are not the only part of the voting universe. Parents can be outvoted. We know that every time we have a school budget discussion in our town meetings.
Yes, of course. And just to be clear, not all soccer moms. Well, all soccer moms are parents, but not all parents are soccer moms. In case you were wondering how that.
Right. However, all parents are either band parents or former band parents. At least in a town like ours.
Yeah, well, maybe so. Soccer band, even smaller niche, but
right,
it happens.
So it's just interesting.
Soccer, I don't know. Yeah.
A range of progressive proposals received support from an overwhelming share of Americans, including creating more affordable childcare options, expanding family medical leave. Bringing back the expanded tax rate for most families with children, expanding universal preschool for all 3- and 4-year-olds. Interestingly, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, announced yesterday that free school lunch for kids in school because you can't learn with an empty stomach.
That's
the
true.
point is these are popular proposals and Democrats should run on them.
Yeah, I don't know. All of a sudden it turns out it's popular to help people.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
Their families.
So for all the noise about Republicans, remember, it only applies to Republican primaries. Right? And there was this whole contretemps on Twitter about calling out center-left pundits who, by name, with specific examples, which I don't need to go into, about how after Roe Dobbs, they said, well, don't get too carried away with running on this abortion issue. It can only take you so far. No. I mean, people care about this, and you win on it. And don't be afraid to run on it. And the same is true for the issues we were just going over. So since you had brought it up, I just thought that I would point out that DeSantis's campaign and his agenda aren't all that popular throughout the country. And I would still venture to say that outside of Republican circles, people still don't know who he is, which is why he polls as well as he does.
Okay.
Now, people do know who Donald Trump is.
Yeah, we don't like that.
And he polls the way he polls, so I don't think that name recognition has much to do with anything there. But I saw an interesting thing about Trump. And again, it's interesting because I learned something I didn't know. It may not be interesting to anybody who already knew this.
It's interesting that you didn't know it.
You and Armando may know this, but I didn't know this. So Donald Trump is going to write a book called Letters to Trump.
Donald Trump is writing a book called, okay.
And what he's going to do is publish unpublished letters from celebrities to him about him.
So he's not writing the book. He's editing a compendium. But he doesn't understand. Okay.
Well, he's the author.
He's going to get the money. That's the point.
Well, he's going to get campaign stuff about saying things like, people like Oprah really love me. Look at these letters. And I looked at it, and my first reaction was, celebrity, remember, he was on The Apprentice. So celebrities write and speak to each other in glowing terms and compliment each other because it's good for business, news at 11, and why are we interested in this? Yeah. But and this big picture that Axios has, why it matters. The book called Letters to Trump is a flashback to the days when famous people frequently wrote chatty letters to each other and when Trump was the toast of many boldface names. So, it's an era where people actually wrote letters.
Right.
Rather than emails and texts to each other, on the one hand.
Like the Civil War.
But
yeah,
there's this thing that happened. You know the story of J.D. Salinger and his letters?
No.
So J.D. Salinger was
letters?
an intensely private person.
Yes, that I remember.
He died in 2010. He lived in a little town in New Hampshire. He wouldn't tell people what his phone number was. He had an unlisted address, a post office box. Only the postman knew who he was and where he was.
Yeah, all right.
But he had written letters to people, and this fancy schmancy British literary critic by the name of Ian Hamilton, who had written a biography about a guy named Robert Lowell, a poet, decided he was going to write a book about Salinger. So he had gotten Lowell Estates permission to write about Lowell, and he asked Salinger, and Salinger said, "Get the hell away from me. Who the hell are you?"
All right.
Step one foot on my property and I'll, sick the dogs on you. So Salinger wanted nothing to do with it. So Hamilton decided, in his infinite wisdom, as a respected British literary critic, that he was going to collect letters that Salinger had written to people as part of his biography.
All right.
So some of these letters are in museums and, libraries, and so they're public material.
Okay.
Some of them are private and were written to friends. In fact, because they move in the same circle, some were friends and neighbors of Hamilton, so he was able to get a hold of them and collect them. And he used excerpts of these letters in his book to make a point about Salinger. So he put together the book, and then he had proofs, and he sent the proofs around for people to look at. One of the people who got a hold of the proofs was a literary agent of Salinger's who sent the book to Salinger, and Salinger said, "I'm going to copyright all my letters, and you can't publish this."
Oh, well.
They are unpublished, and you can't do this.
Oh.
And Hamilton, through Random House, said, "Wait a minute, this is fair use. We can." So it went to court.
All right.
And the district court found in favor of Random House, but on appeal, the appeals court, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, ruled in favor of Salinger and said it's not that it's unpublished, it's that in general, the author of the letter is the one really that has the copyright. It's their work.
Yeah,
they can decide at a later date that maybe they want to publish it themselves. So you're taking business away from them. And sure, there's fair use for scholarship and all of that. But on the whole, the right to publish belongs with the writer of the letter.
Yeah,
which was
interesting.
amended by the U.S. House at some point to say, but fair use still applies, and just because it's unpublished doesn't mean that you can never use it. You just have to use it judiciously.
If he was writing a book about, his interpretation of what
it's the usual fair use stuff. How much of it did you take?
Oh, that's true, too.
And what are you doing with it? And what's the purpose? All the things that decide fair use. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert.
But a compendium of letters wouldn't fly. Okay.
Right. So, but the point is that at first pass, the right to have it published belongs with the person who wrote the letters, not the person who received the letters.
Okay.
So now Trump is writing this book with letters that he received from all these other people.
If he received them, yes.
If they're real.
What if he's lying?
They're all liars. So you can't trust anything. But that's the point, right? So now he's going to publish this book.
I'm copywriting lying.
What if the people who wrote the letters don't want it published?
Yeah. Good question. I don't know, and I mean, he may not care.
He loves being sued.
Yes,
he'll get more publicity than you get to talk about him again. But I don't know that necessarily helps him, and it just reminds people that he's really stupid.
Yeah, and I mean, lazy. I'm writing a book. What's it about? It's full of stuff that other people wrote. Oh, well, then you're not writing a book. I am writing my name on the book. That is what I'm doing. All right, well. That's interesting. So, okay, lots of, there will be, of course, people who want to retain copyright in those things, especially people who wrote, stupid fluff letters like, thank you for,
having me on your show.
Yeah,
now I can
right.
have you on my show. Thank you very much. I loved it. Perhaps we should run together sometime as a team.
Exactly. Right. Dear neighbor, please make sure trash is out by 6 a.m. Oh, thank you.
Does it mean anything or doesn't mean, just there's nothing about what he does that in the end really has any depth.
Right.
And, if you dig a little deeper, it doesn't have any thought. If you dig a little deeper than that, it's probably illegal.
Okay. So lots of interesting correspondence.
Everything he does is in that category.
He has a very difficult time. I've always said telling the difference between things that he has ownership of and things that he has possession of. And
when you have no shame.
Yes.
And you have no morals.
Right. And you don't mind.
You basically want to do things because I want to, and that's it. And then you figure it out later. And if you have enough money, you're eccentric.
Right, exactly. You're a criminal, eccentric.
Yeah,
okay.
That's the one with the money.
Right.
So, speaking of criminal and eccentric and liars, let's get back a little bit to the Tucker Carlson Fox News Dominion situation.
Criminal.
Wrapped up with January 6th.
Yes.
NBC Nightly News actually had a segment on the whole story, which was fascinating.
Night, anyway.
They usually, the big news media don't usually touch each other. When they cover stuff. There was a big segment on Tucker Carlson got stuff that Kevin McCarthy, and he showed it, and it wasn't true, and they were lying about it, and it's a big deal, and Dominion, and they're being sued. And so, really? You're covering this like it's news? Good.
Right. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Everybody should do that.
Right. Okay.
In fact, there's a piece here from Dan Pfeiffer. Exactly that. How to fight a vulnerable Fox News. Basically says, treat Fox News like Breitbart. If they call you, don't return their calls. Okay. Treat them like they're a partisan organization that you are not required to participate with.
Okay. I'll agree.
Just do it. The days of considering Fox News as a journalistic outfit are over.
They really
He writes, there's no objective journalists at Fox. There's just obvious propagandists writing opinion pieces and more dangerously subtle propagandists who pretend to be journalists. And that's how you have to treat them. And that's true. It's absolutely true, and that's the way it should be.
Okay.
More on that. This is Micah Soliner for a Congress reporter for Punchbowl News. That's how she describes herself, a Congress reporter, not a congressional reporter.
All right. Interesting.
Covering the U.S. House of Representatives, mostly Republicans, writes, the GOP is discussing the D.C. crime bill in conference. They're discussing how it's an example of a win for House Republican majority as well as bipartisanship. They're celebrating. The champagne is broken out.
Really?
They got the Democrats. Yada, yada, yada. And Heather Cagle, who also works for Punchbowl. In fact, she's a managing editor, stepped back a little bit and said,
she's a judge.
Meanwhile, all the news oxygen is being consumed by the Republican divide over January 6th. Footage Tucker Carlson, et cetera, instead of being focused on Dems in disarray, which is what the Republicans want. So they can, toast themselves all they want to. It's like the discussion about woke. They congratulate themselves because amongst their smaller circle of themselves, they think themselves is wonderful.
Okay. Well,
so what? And that's nice. Close the door. You could do whatever you want, and we'll go on with life. Everybody's talking about January 6th and Tucker Carlson. They're not talking about this D.C. bill that nobody's going to remember. I said in a year, but in fact, nobody's going to remember it in 10 minutes.
No, right. Well, 10 minutes has passed.
Right. And as Norm Orenstein wrote, for people who don't want to talk about January 6th, they're spending a lot of time talking about January 6th.
True. Yeah, right. Well, I don't know why they... I think they're changing over from not talking about it to trying to spin it as a positive.
Yeah, now we have to defend it because we know it's not going away. We realized we can't just ignore it after all this time and losing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So now we have to do something about it. So that's right. Greg Sargent has a column here along those lines. Revealing Fox News texts point to the right's long war on the truth. Basically, it's a 30-year effort to build a bubble so that the only news that the right-wing conservatives get is from Fox and people like them. More after the break on that.
All right.
But that's why they can't afford to tell the truth, because they've set up this closed situation where only their news gets to them. And then what happens when that audience finds out they're lying?
We're not sure yet. It takes a while to break through. But all right, we live in exciting times, I suppose. We'll find out.
Right? Did you know there was a time Hannity championed immigration reform, got blowback, and he pulled it away?
No, but that sounds.
I didn't remember that, but that happened.
Yeah, well, I wasn't watching. Someone had to tell me. Okay, more after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just for the record, it occurred to me as we were heading into break, I didn't say anything about it, but the fact of the matter is that Mitch McConnell is in the hospital. He has suffered another fall, this time at a hotel in D.C. after a dinner that he was attending, and there's not much more that anyone wants or needs to know about it, but he's in the hospital receiving treatment. No further details on his condition, and it happens to him from time to time. You may recall he fell at home a while ago. Took him a while to bounce back. He's only older now, so we'll see when he's back in the public eye after this. So just wanted to note it for the record because it did happen, and we don't know anything more about it. So we'll wait and see.
Right. I mean, it's not like he had a stroke or anything like that. He has a history, of course, of having polio as a kid, and he's always had trouble with stairs. And he's fallen before. He broke a shoulder a couple of years ago, so this is probably more of the same.
Okay. Yeah.
And he'll be back.
Yes, we can't get rid of him that easily.
Right.
Okay.
So going back to Fox News, Nicole Hemmer was interviewed by Greg Sargent for this article. And she says, behind Fox News' "We Report, You Decide" was his real message, which is you should trust us and not other outlets. And that message worked, and the scandal's in a way the result of right-wing media's grip on the audience. In late 2021, polling data showed that consumers of Fox News and other conservative media were overwhelmingly more likely to believe 2020 election was stolen from them.
Sure.
This came after sources relentlessly bombarded their viewers with that message. But now the audience's captivity to an alternate version of events is blowing back on Fox. Over the years, Fox News audience has rebelled over other things, such as Hannity's championing of immigration reform, which incited a backlash from its viewers. But nothing is compared to the current scandal. It's a pretty clarifying moment, Hemmer told Sargent. The network's own personalities, she concluded, have now admitted we have to tell our audience not what happened, but what they want to hear, or we're going to lose them. Mm-hmm. That's where you admit we're not a news outlet, right. And that's where Dan Pfeiffer's suggestion to treat them like Breitbart comes in. Nobody has to treat Breitbart like a news outlet. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just NBC News. The White House went after Tucker Carlson by name over the January 6th coverage, which is really unusual.
Okay.
And, I think they may, in all honesty, wait for the court case where Fox loses before they start banning them from White House
I'm sure they
correspondence outfits. But they certainly are not obligated to return their calls, which is different than allowing them to come in and ask questions.
Well, yeah, they were never obligated to return their calls when people thought they were a news network. They don't return all calls from ABC or NBC. So
right. So this is interesting because it's from a conservative website called The Dispatch, where Jonah Goldberg and others write. Sort of like a National Review. I mean, they're David French. These are normie conservatives. Most of them are never Trumpers. It's kind of interesting just hearing things from their perspective. They look at the Carlson thing as being just a disaster for Fox and Carlson. Apart from currying favor with Carlson, it's hard to see how McCarthy's conference will benefit from releasing the footage and attracting more attention to January 6th. Portraying the rioters as martyred tourists may win praise from a conspiracy-addled chunk of Republican primary voters, but if the GOP's disappointing 2022 midterms are any indication, that's a sugar high headed for a ballot booth crash. Likely aware of this reality, many Republican lawmakers found themselves squirming on Tuesday when pressed for their thoughts on Carlson's version of events. Several embraced the reporting, like Mike Collins of Georgia, who demanded the release of all J6 prisoners.
Okay. Right. That's a House version.
Must be MTG contingent.
Yeah. Well,
and Representative Thomas Massey gushed to Carlson for his exposure of so many lies, while others claimed, like McCarthy, that they hadn't seen the segment.
Right. We remember that excuse came back.
I don't know what everybody's afraid of, said Chip Roy. Everybody should watch the tapes and make up their own mind. Senate Republicans, with a couple of exceptions, had much less patience. Tom Tillis in North Carolina labeled Carlson's antics bullshit.
Oh, we know.
And Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina told reporters that although he thought the January 6th Select Committee was partisan, he didn't want to whitewash what happened. It's sad to see Tucker Carlson go off the rails like that, Mitt Romney said. You can't hide the truth by selectively picking a few minutes out of tapes and saying this is what went on. It's so absurd. It's nonsense. Yes. Mitch McConnell said he wanted to associate himself entirely with the opinion of Chief Menger, the U.S. Capitol Police Chief. It's a mistake, in my view, for Fox News to depict this in a way that's completely at variance with what our chief law enforcement official here at the Capitol thinks, McConnell added, demurring on whether McCarthy made a mistake. You guys know I have many faults, and one of them is not answering the question in a way that I don't want to answer it, he said with a smile. Right. I'm not going to tell you that McCarthy's an idiot. You all know he's an idiot. You don't need me to confirm it for you. Just go ahead and write it. But I'm not saying
it. You didn't hear it from me. One source close to how dumb McCarthy is said.
Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas was less oblique. I don't really have a problem with making the video public, but if your message is then to try to convince people that nothing bad happened, then it's just going to make us all look silly, he told Politico. It's definitely stupid to keep talking about this. So what's the purpose of continuing to bring it up unless you're trying to feed Democrat narratives? Indeed, Democrats happily accepted the opportunity.
Okay.
Carlson reveled in the bipartisan blowback his episode received. They're on the same side, he told his viewers last night with a snicker. They're all on the same side. So it's actually not about left and right and not about Republican and Democrat. Have Here you have people with shared interests, the open borders people, the Mitch McConnells who are living in splendor on Chinese money, the people who underneath it all have everything in common, are all aligned against everybody else.
Yes.
So they
all
conclude, maybe he's onto something. Or maybe he's just an asshole.
Well, it's one or the other.
I would ask
maybe both. Or
John Stewart what his opinion is about Tucker Carlson.
Yes, right. Well, it's a...
it's bad for democracy. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Crenshaw, I mean, that's kind of he should write for the Dispatch. It's a normie position to take, right? I don't have any problem with releasing the video, but don't lie about it.
Don't lie about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are problems with releasing the video, by the way, but...
There are tons of problems with it. However, don't forget, and to be fair, because we always like to be fair.
No.
When we do.
When we do.
That many different news organizations, NBC, ABC, et cetera, have requested this video.
Yes.
Right. Carlson's not the only media outlet. I won't call him a news organization, but Fox is a media outlet. And so many have requested it. Only Fox got access.
Right.
So there's a number of things wrong with that. One is that you're giving it to somebody you know is going to manipulate it because they're propagandists.
Right.
And the other is that it completely puts to light everything Kevin McCarthy says about transparency.
Yes. There's also, a political use of public property. And, of course, it's also, there's the security
contributions.
Issues.
Charge them.
Yeah, well, I guess you could do that. All right. Well, it's one option to do it that way, and and then there's the other concern of well, now everybody will know where all the security cameras are. Although I don't know, maybe they should move them around anyway. I don't know.
And civil isn't criminal, but these guys are crooks anyway you look at it. So then we get back to politics. Biden's going to release tomorrow, or maybe today, a dead-on-arrival budget, says the New York Times, picking a fight with the GOP.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't know if you're listening for the first time ever in your life, or you've just forgotten. This is a practice that's like, I don't know, at least 50 years old, I would think,
if not
declaring budgets dead on arrival, but it has to do with
the thing.
Yeah, and it is. That's the process. The president suggests a budget, and then the Congress writes their own. It's kind of required by law, and they're not the same documents. So what do you do with the earlier document? Okay, well, it's dead. Was it dead on arrival? Yeah, it was.
This is actually a relatively fairly written piece here. Let me give you the gist of it.
It's normal to hear that.
Practice, but essentially what the piece says is that Biden is setting up a stark contrast between what the Democrats want to do and what the Republicans want to do, and that's just fine.
Yeah,
nothing wrong with that. Okay. Mr. Biden's budget, I mean, that's what the whole State of the Union thinks about. It's not like the State of the Union then has to be enacted because Biden said it. It's his chance to outline his party's priorities in his own.
Yes, right. But you don't write. This is a dead on arrival speech, but I guess you.
Right.
It's all right. It's almost lost its punch at this point.
It has. Mr. Biden's budget proposal, the third of his presidency, so it's not like even Biden hasn't done this before, is an attempt to advance a narrative that the president is committed to investing in American manufacturing, fighting corporate profiteering, reducing budget deficits, and fending off conservative attacks on safety net programs. Mm-hmm. That's not a bad agenda. I like that.
Right.
It is expected to include what White House officials say will be nearly $3 trillion in new deficit reduction, largely from a familiar batch of tax increases on companies, along with robust spending on the military, policies to further Biden's attempts to support high-tech factory jobs and fight climate change. So, again, like the State of the Union, here's what our priorities are. Meanwhile, Republicans are expected to offer a starkly different budget sometime this spring, one likely to be stocked with cuts to federal health programs, aid to the poor. In an effort to eliminate the budget deficit within a decade without raising taxes, Mr. Biden is certain to reject these proposals, and they may struggle to attract enough moderate Republican votes to pass the House. So essentially, Biden is going to suggest something that's really popular with the public, and the Republicans are going to suggest something that's really unpopular with the public that may not even pass their own party. And who's going to win this fight?
Right. Okay. Fight between two dead on arrival budgets.
Right. The competing documents will highlight the dearth of common ground for Mr. Biden and his opposition party. Well, duh. Where have you been since 2016?
Right. I don't know. Watching summits between the two sides that have irreconcilable differences over the budget.
Right. And I'll just finish with
That's
this mid-article quote from Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, who urged lawmakers not to play games, saying there's no way to prevent a financial meltdown without raising the borrowing cap. So the children in the House aren't going to listen, and we're going to have a crisis.
Okay. Well, you had to throw that back in there. That's true. That hasn't gone away. We've just not focused on it because they took a big vacation. And
well, part of this article is to start focusing people again on what's coming down the road.
Yes,
but first, I think the Republicans have to do their own budget.
Yes,
before they argue about, well, you can't raise the debt limit until you do. Well, we have to tell you what it is we want you to do. We haven't done that yet.
I guess
McCarthy's complaining that Biden isn't coming to the table with proposals, and Biden is saying, I don't need to make proposals, just raise the cap. No, we won't until you do certain things. Well, then you're the one that has to make the proposals. Okay. No, you do it first. No, that's not how it works. If that's what you want to do, just raise the cap if you don't have any.
I guess.
And if you have them, tell us what they are. You can't have it both ways. Yeah, we can because we're Republicans, and besides, look over there, January 6th. You want to talk about that? Really? No, well, no, but Democrats in disarray. Really?
Now, see if that works.
You can't even pass your own budget, and you want to talk about Democrats in disarray? Go ahead.
Maybe the January 6th tourists weren't tourists. Maybe they were there to write a budget, and Democrats kicked them out, and that's why we have no budget.
So let's look to the states for another example of democracy small d in action. Reporter Jonathan Oosting reported last night, Michigan Democratic-led House votes repeal right-to-work law in 56-53 vote. And Dana Hole, our friend Dana, throws in, not only that, they also passed civil rights protections for LGBTQ, repealed the 1931 ban on abortions, and that was today. Well, it was last night. He wrote that yesterday.
Okay.
So, in other words, when Michigan gets to work and democracy does what democracy does, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I know. It's a good one. And by the way, this should be
That's what you voted for, folks. That's what you worked so hard to get done in Michigan.
And I'll point out that it is a narrow majority, but it's a trifecta, and this is an example, by the way, of Democrats winning a relatively narrow majority, but a majority nonetheless, and then actually doing solid work and real things that they said that they were going to do, and in a rather aggressive fashion, which is something we haven't seen for a long time, and that people came to believe couldn't happen.
Right. You're sick and tired of hearing what Republicans in Florida and Texas and
how come we don't do that?
How come we don't do that?
Right.
Well, we do.
But the things are a lot more grounded in reality and actually help people, which is interesting, as opposed to, these weird flights of fancy about things that they need to stop people from doing versus, well, how about we allow people to actually organize at work or...
Well, not only that, sometimes I think, if I'm not mistaken, I could be, but I think Republicans have 22 trifectas, and now the Democrats have 17, so they're catching up. The rest are split. And the 22 includes places like Nebraska, where there's a unicameral body, but they're really like Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, sometimes you need a quadrifecta. Because like in Wisconsin, which is coming up next month, you have to have the Supreme Court on your side.
Yes.
The purportedly nonpartisan thing is always going to rule in favor of Republicans if you keep voting conservatives onto the bodies that allow you to vote them on. Not all Supreme Courts are voted on, but for the ones that are, if people keep electing conservatives, they're going to approve extreme gerrymandering, approve right to life laws, whether or not and they're going to approve right to work laws, and they're going to approve a whole bunch of stuff, like in Tennessee. The courts there will say, yeah, fine, I don't care what the Constitution says. We read it as saying you can do that.
Yeah, you can.
Those who have the gavel make the rules.
Right.
So that's why the Wisconsin Supreme Court election next month is so important. And at the same time, it's just interesting that, yes, you're right. You can start hearing about what Democrats can do, and it's important. And small d democracy, that's okay. When you win the trifecta for the first time in 40 years, you can pass the stuff you want.
Yeah.
That's what happened in Michigan. When the Republicans do it, they can pass the stuff they want. That's what happened in Wisconsin, and we see the difference.
Yep.
One is empowering the citizens. The other is trying to make sure a minority has supreme rule forever. And one's good and one's bad, but that's my opinion.
I agree. And I just wanted to at least point out that it's a thing that people have thought. How come we don't when we? And now we see that at least someone has tried.
Does.
They have. That's true. Right. And I don't know
Michigan
whether people take
New
that
York
for
doesn't,
granted
because New York Democrats are Republicans in disguise.
Well, that's bad news, and that's something that needs to be resolved. But we can at least celebrate having seen it now in Michigan. I think people take it for granted in California, but they do that, and that's why California always has they're out front on a lot of environmental and health issues on a lot of things, and people sometimes roll their eyes about California having their own standards for things, but of course they're by far the largest population, most populous state. It could stand as their own country, as we've been told a number of times before.
Yeah, a fifth the economy, but large states like Texas can set
Michigan
the standard for things like textbooks. Water them down because we won't buy them if you don't.
Mm-hmm. And California can use its leverage to push back, as their governor has occasionally
Which they should.
considered doing. Yeah.
So I turned to the Detroit Free Press because I always like going local first.
It's free as well.
But it's not. And they don't always cover it the way I want. They're very detailed. There's a lovely article in the Detroit Free Press, for example, about Michigan House passes bills to repeal right to work, and then a second different article about how House votes to expand background checks on gun sales with all the details you would want. But it's the New York Times that has the bigger picture. Newly empowered Michigan Democrats move on labor, gay rights, and guns. Despite Republican objections, the Michigan House of Representatives voted to repeal a right-to-work law, codify LGBTQ rights, and expand gun background checks. The Republican objective in passing right-to-work laws, as is always the case, is to decrease the power of unions. They claim it's because they want to improve the economy. Yes. But their real goal is to decrease the power of unions. And that's why it was such a big deal to pass that, and that's why it's such a big deal to unpass that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
The rapid-fire votes were possible only because Michigan Democrats narrowly won a trifecta, control of both legislative chambers and the governor's office in last year's election after spending much of the prior decade on the lawmaking sidelines. So basically, Big Reg got what she wanted.
Okay. Now,
it still has to go to the Senate, and then she still has to sign it, but, progress.
Yep, and they control the Senate, so there's a likelihood that it will make its way to her desk. That's good. I know we confuse people now. I think about using the term trifecta and you inventing, I think, the term quadrifecta. I don't know if that's a real thing,
a
word or
not real.
But I think
real.
Referring to these things as trifecta, the two houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion, or
is it
presidency.
A difecta?
I mean, it's
Nebraska?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Bifecta? I don't know. That's a good question. We should ask the Nebraskans what they use for it. But one, pointing out in states where the Supreme Court is elected, yes, you do have to capture that too. But then I think this leads to a lot of confusion where people come away and you ask them what the three branches of government are, and they say the House, the Senate, and the
Fox
president.
News.
Yeah, maybe. Right. And you forget about the judiciary, and that's the branch. There's only one branch. It's legislative, and I know it's confusing, and we use it wrong. And I hope that we all understand it and are confusing the foreign observers only.
I'm just
a
Bill.
So.
I remember watching that. I get it. I know.
Okay. Well, they didn't use trifecta in that, but maybe they should have. All right. It's a weird situation, and yeah, Nebraska. I'll have to. And all they have is the Senate, right? I think they call it.
Then there's New Hampshire. I don't know what you call it because, like, every citizen is part of the legislature.
That's everybody fecta. It's just I don't know what to say. Phone
all
tree.
Hands
fecta.
on deck fecta.
I guess so. Wow.
But a reminder, however, nothing is perfect in this country. Michigan, the home of small d democracy, was also the home of trying to capture, kidnap, and kill the governor.
Yes, it's a close call whether or not democracy prevails there.
Right.
Okay. Keep
But,
working. That means you have to show up and vote. It's either you show up and vote
stuff.
or they murder people.
You get depressed sometimes about how bad things are in this country. Israel has it worse. Israel is truly having a national crisis right now. The right-wing government is trying to take over their quadrifecta.
All the factors.
Well, they have the Knesset, they have whoever's in the prime minister's seat, and the judiciary is completely independent. They want to change that and make it beholden to rules and regulations set by the conservative, super ultra orthodox right-wing parties.
Yeah,
and that's bad. It's essentially not only allowing Benjamin Netanyahu to get off the hook for being looked at for corruption.
Yeah.
But it also means that if there's any civil rights for anybody, forget it. If the right wing decides it's not there, it's not there. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's a big crisis. And there's moratorium, Vietnam style size protests in the streets almost every day now about what's going on. It's starting to involve American Jews and who from the Israeli government is welcome here on invitation.
It's a huge issue.
If you have a right-wing minister who basically wants to deport all the Arabs, or at least only the troublemakers, or wipe out Palestinian villages, you don't necessarily want to invite him to a conference and give him an award or something.
Yes, this would be like hosting AfD members from Germany, right?
And so there's a lot going on here, and it doesn't necessarily make the American press, but Haaretz and Times of Jerusalem Post are covering it fairly well. So if you're interested in that, there's lots of source material. It's important, and it's different, and it's never happened there before.
In addition to those street protests, what brought it to my attention is there are protests among members of the military who say the independent judiciary
are not going to report because you guys are going too far.
Right.
And businesses are pulling out.
It's very interesting.
So between, there's a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. It's not that he can just have his way. He may wind up literally ruining the country in the process of trying to do this.
Whoops. Well, I'm sure he thought he was saving it. But there are lots of people insisting, and it's a big deal if large swaths of the Israeli military refuse to report for duty. That's
I don't know if it's large swaths.
Crazy.
Now here's the problem. Why, if there appears to be this overwhelming majority, why don't they just vote themselves into power? And how did this happen? And there's no easy answer to that, but there is an answer.
All right.
And part of that answer is who are citizens of Israel? And what do you do with the Arab parties? Do you include this in them, with them? Do you include them in your government? Do you include them in your politics? Or do you exclude them? If you exclude them, you have much less of a majority, which Israelis found out the last 10 elections. So it's not allowed in contemporary Israeli politics to include Israeli citizens who happen to be Arab in your political parties.
No,
there's a separate list who may or may not vote with you.
Not great.
If this reminds you of South Africa, I'm not going there. I'm just saying it's weird.
It reminds many people of that.
And Israeli Arabs are split themselves in terms of what do we do about it? Do we participate or do we not participate? And so that's part of why it's so complicated. So keep an eye on this.
Yes, and don't forget
potentially
the
very explosive
non-Jewish but also non-Arab Israeli citizenry. That's part of the population there as well. It's not a huge percentage, but if you were
they
confused
often have
before,
prestige positions.
They do,
the
and they do get very often included in government, Druze parties, etc. And their Arab neighbors have a good question in posing the question of why them and not us? I don't know. Yeah, I can't solve it. They can't solve it. You can't look at me. I can't solve it. We just have 2 hours.
Yes, let's just deal with something simple like time travel.
Yes, all right. Next. All right.
So
well,
anyway, just keep an eye on that. So a lot happening. We talked in the show yesterday about how things are changing in Europe. Things are changing in the Middle East as well. Things are changing in our relations with China. China's becoming not an adversary but the enemy, which is tricky.
Ooh.
And may or may not be a good idea. David Rothkopf is writing in the Daily Beast on this. What Washington is getting wrong about dealing with China, so that's another thing that one needs to keep an eye on. We don't want to return to the era of neocons, even if we find the occasional never-Trumper interesting to read or listen to.
Okay.
But I heard a very interesting discussion about them. Hunter Walker led this off on Twitter and said, why are we paying so much attention to never-Trumpers anyway? They don't have any power. They have no constituency. They can't do anything in the Republican Party. The choice is going to be between DeSantis and Trump. So why do we even listen to these grifters?
I don't know.
And he suggests the reason is that because they represent the idealized Republican opposition that the well-off and comfortable fat cat reporters like to imagine exist in Washington, except don't anymore.
Okay.
And they're articulate, and they show up on cable, and they dominate cable panels about stuff. Because you can't have the super ultra right-wing people on. They're nuts. Like an MSNBC isn't going to have Jim Jordan on to explain what the Republicans are doing with their weaponization committees.
Yeah.
So you have David Jolly.
I guess.
Because what does David Jolly represent? Nothing.
No.
But
then you
he's
can't
smart,
go wrong.
he's articulate, he can explain it, but he has no political power. Whatever he represents doesn't get votes either in the Congress or in elections. And so it's an interesting dichotomy. What do you do with folks like that?
That's a good question. And I mean, if you have airtime to fill, you can't bring people who actually have power in the House because they're just going to say Jewish space lasers, and then you're going to not know what to do. Wow. Well, that is a conundrum. So I don't know. In the meantime,
that's part of the reason why I pay attention to them, because at least they can explain it. They're articulate, and I don't mind reading them. I don't want Marjorie Taylor Greene to explain it to me.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Now what are we going to do? All right, well, Greg's gone for the weekend. Going to gather up more stories over the next couple of days and share them with us when he returns. And let's see, in the meantime, we can perhaps turn back to the story earlier mentioned about the various methods of organization around the oh my god woke / CRT / groomers / drag queen emergency agenda and how it's affecting people. I guess, well, I don't know. Perhaps we'll start with, this might be a rather lengthy read, but we better get started. In Mother Jones, if we can in fact see the entire text, and it looks like, at least for the time being, we can. We have a piece from Madison Pauley, sort of a sneak peek behind the scenes of how things are going so crazy on the right. What's making them do this, besides idiocy? And the organizing portion of the question, inside the secret working group that helped push anti-trans laws across the country. We keep hearing stories about one state after another bringing these anti-trans laws to the fore and trying to one-up each other on how harsh their laws can be, or who and how many people they threaten to put in prison for even saying the word transgender or what have you. And if you got the sense that this was a coordinated effort, you are probably right. And I guess now you'll get a glimpse at who those people are. it would be easy to imagine that it would be something like ALEC, I suppose, passing these things around. But they may not traffic in this kind of weirdness as much as we think. But let's take a look. Leaked emails are what are giving people a glimpse of the religious right networks behind transgender healthcare bans, according to Madison Paula here. And now we'll jump right in. On a Saturday afternoon in August of 2019, way back when, South Dakota Republican State Representative Fred Deutsch sent an email to 18 anti-trans activists, doctors, and lawyers with the text of a bill that he planned to introduce that would make it a felony for doctors to give transgender children under 16 gender-affirming medical care, which is sort of a catch-all term that at this point, allows Republicans to just say, gender-affirming medical care, the kind of gender-affirming medical care that kids under 16 were getting is, as it turns out, ordinarily nothing at all, and maybe in all cases, nothing at all like what they're fear-mongering about. Oh, they're mutilating children. They're giving them, transgender surgeries and et cetera, when in fact it turns out not to actually be the case, and that people have to wait a considerable period of time and go through all sorts of therapies and counseling prior to actually having the surgeries. But that doesn't matter to people who are interested in lying about these things. All right. Well, let's see. So they would make it a felony for doctors to give transgender children under 16 gender-affirming medical care. And also, by the way, keep in mind, the subtext in all of this is very often especially for some of the older teens for whom it's becoming very clear that they are transgender, or at least non-binary, non-gender conforming, however they choose to identify themselves, but that without, how shall I put it? I guess to say it's the reason that the care is supposed to be affirming, whether it's affirming of gender or anything else for that matter, is that without that kind of support and affirmation, a lot of times these kids are at the brink of suicide, and it's like a suicide prevention program as much as anything else. And it's interesting that the pro-life Christian conservatives are so interested in saying, to hell with it, either kill yourself or don't. Just let's criminalize doctors trying to give people care that will keep them alive and supported until they reach an age and maturity where they can actually make decisions about more drastic measures that they might be interested in taking later on in life. Anyway, I mean, if common sense and reason had any sway here, I suppose the argument would have been over a long time ago. But it's not. Instead, we have this South Dakota Republican, Fred Deutsch, saying things like, "I have no doubt this will be an uphill battle when we get to session," he warned his group. "As always, please do not share this with the media. The longer we can fly under the radar, the better." Now, if you're saving America, saving lives, stopping the bad stuff that is woke/CRT/ everything else we want to demonize, why fly under the radar? Okay. The message was one in a trove of emails obtained by Mother Jones between Deutsch and representatives of the network of activists and organizations at the forefront of the anti-trans movement. They show the degree to which these activists shaped Deutsch's repressive legislation, a version of which was signed into law in February, and the tactics, alliances, and goals of a movement that has sought to foist their agenda on a national scale. It's the sort of thing that when other people succeed in promulgating their agenda, these guys say, "You're cramming it down our throats." But apparently you're not supposed to say that about Christian conservatives. They don't cram things down people's throats, apparently. They certainly do. They just don't use those terms. In messages back and forth, some members of the group pushed Deutsch to make the bill even more restrictive. Bernadette Broyles, that's the real name of this person, apparently. The president and general counsel of a Georgia-based law firm called the Child and Parental Rights Campaign urged him to raise the age threshold to 18. Broyles, who is also affiliated with the conservative Christian legal powerhouse Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF, warned that other religious right groups might not support the bill if you start by giving away 16 and 17-year-olds right out from the outset. Oh, interesting. Okay. Others, including Andre Van Mol, M-O-L, a member of a fringe conservative doctors group that calls itself the American College of Pediatricians. That's a fringe group trying to disguise itself as something mainstream, American College of Pediatricians, raised concerns that the bill as written might backfire by accidentally blocking healthcare providers from attempting to change a child's perception of their sex when kids identify as transgender. Deutsch agreed to rewrite the section. At the time, there was little precedent for such bills, and Deutsch's legislation, called the Vulnerable Child Protection Act, was killed in the Senate after doctors showed up at the South Dakota State House to argue that they should not be sent to prison for following the medical consensus. Though our session in South Dakota is now over and our efforts to protect gender-confused vulnerable children failed, I continue to receive ugly email and social media posts, Deutsch complained to the group in March of 2020. He's having a hard time with his public leadership status. Darn. Please do not say that the South Dakota effort failed. Margaret Clark, general counsel for the Alabama branch of the Phyllis Schlafly-founded Eagle Forum, replied, "You successfully inspired, encouraged, and counseled numerous VCAP, I don't know what that's supposed to stand for, VCAP, but it's got the little sick afterwards, so I don't know what it is. Vulnerable Child Protection Act, that should be VCPA, and she said VCAP, I see. You successfully inspired, encouraged, and counseled numerous such efforts around the country. You established the ideal witness list that we are all still following in our individual states, and most importantly, you connected us all to each other. This is just the beginning." True in a way, yes, the bill didn't succeed and be passed, it wasn't passed into law in South Dakota at that point, but she's pointing out, like Bakhmut, all right? They're inflicting damage on the other side, and maybe that's enough for them for the beginning. And yeah, they operate a little bit like ALEC in the sense of the cut and paste. This guy introduced the bill. Now I'm going to introduce the same bill, just steal the text. We had hearings on the bill here in the South Dakota State Legislature. These were our witnesses. Well, I'll just invite the same witnesses and fly them in to my state when it comes time to have a hearing on my bill. It operates in that respect very much like ALEC. Indeed, Deutsch's bill has proved influential in the recent surge of anti-LGBTQ lawmaking. This legislative session, at least 18 states have considered bills containing language closely resembling the text of the Vulnerable Child Protection Act. The leaked emails reveal how Deutsch's proposal helped proponents of the national movement to restrict gender-affirming care establish a playbook for their own now common tactics. They've very much increased sophistication since then, but the roots are there, says activist and writer Erin Reed, who tracks anti-trans legislation. Reed says that when she meets with legislators, they're often surprised to learn of the outside forces pushing anti-trans bills. This isn't coming from an in-state grassroots support system, she says. The emails demonstrate close collaboration between groups working behind the scenes to push bills banning transgender health care, including ADF, which has defended state-sanctioned sterilization of trans people in Europe, and the ACP, or the ACPEDS, as they call it, the American College of Pediatricians, not the American College of Pedophiles, but the ACPEDS, which has opposed adoption by gay couples and supported conversion therapy for LGBTQ youth. In recent years, ADF has drafted legislation banning trans children from using school restrooms or playing on school sports teams that align with their gender identity. Both groups are also staunchly anti-abortion, in case you were wondering about that. ADF, which drafted the Mississippi abortion ban at the heart of the case that overturned Roe v. Wade, Dobbs, is currently representing ACPs in a closely watched lawsuit to ban an abortion pill. You remember how Joan was pronouncing it? She's got it down pat. Mifepristone? I don't remember. I can't even recall. I liked it better when they used the numbers and letters. RU486. That was easier to pronounce. Anyway, you get the point. Interesting. So ACP, these fringe pediatricians are the ones trying to ban the abortion pill. And I don't know. It doesn't seem like a big part of pediatric medicine, but who knows? Of course, there are underage kids who find themselves pregnant through all sorts of misfortunes who probably could benefit from it. So I guess, I don't know. Do they consider them to be under the care of pediatricians, though? I don't know. At any rate, they just wanted to get in on the Anti-Abortion Act and did. These are groups who we know are not interested in the best practice care for trans kids, says Catherine Oakley, State Legislative Director and Senior Counsel for the Human Rights Campaign. These bills are coming from national organizations whose purpose is to harm LGBTQ people. More than half of transgender and non-binary kids have considered suicide. There's the point being made right there. According to a 2021 survey by the Trevor Project, and 93% say they worry about state laws denying transgender people access to gender-affirming medical care. This treatment approach, which typically includes puberty blockers for pubescent children, cross-sex hormones for teenagers or adults, and almost exclusively for adults, surgeries, represents a broad medical agreement that such care can be crucial for supporting trans kids' well-being. Gender-affirming care is supported by the American Medical Association, the actual collection of doctors that is the mainstream representative of the medical profession in this country, not the fake ones, not things that Rand Paul made up, not fringe ones, etc., etc. The American Medical Association. That's not any different from the actual AMA, the American Medical Association, even though I mispronounced the word association. Who else? The American Academy of Pediatrics. That's what the actual mainstream pediatric medical association is called. And, of course, the American Psychiatric Association, the Endocrine Society, and other major, or as Trump would say, major medical organizations. And they don't support his position on it, but that's what they do support. They have a real consensus. And studies have found that it is associated, the gender-affirming care, with better mental health outcomes over both shorter and longer-term periods. The organizations exchanging emails with Deutsch and his other collaborators aren't shy about their agenda. Several, including ACPEDS, Eagle Forum, and the Christian Medical and Dental Associations, are listed as partners in a campaign dubbed the Promise to America's Children. So sweet sounding. Co-led by ADF, the Heritage Foundation, you know who they are, and the Christian nationalist lobbying group Family Policy Alliance. I don't think I'm quite that familiar with them. The campaign pushes anti-LGBTQ legislation, claiming that the government and media are imposing explicit sexual content on children, meaning information about sexual orientation, gender identity, and abortion. The president of the American Principles Project, a member of the coalition, recently told the New York Times that his group's goal is to eliminate all transition care, starting with children because that's where the consensus is. Lawmakers often, and that's interesting, should point that out, what they're saying, they will eliminate all transition care, starting with children because that's where consensus is. You can get people who are perhaps persuadable, at least, that, grown adults who want to consent to transition care can do whatever they want with themselves. That's part of the freedom of being American. And there are still people who will stand in the way of denying that sort of care to adults who can afford it. That's another issue entirely. But we'll say, all right, but we shouldn't allow kids to do it because they're not mature enough to make this decision. And there's probably a lot of people who would count themselves in that court. But take note of the fact that they're saying, well, we're just starting with it because that's where the consensus is. But eventually, yes, our hope is to deny grown adult citizens of this country the right to the to the surgical treatment that, or whatever the treatment is, with the medical treatment that they want to seek for themselves, even though it's otherwise entirely legal. We will just make it illegal, and then you can't have it. That's a stated goal. They're just trying to stay under the radar with it while they can work on getting the people who think it shouldn't be available to children on board with the rest of their agenda. Lawmakers, the piece continues, lawmakers often seek advice from experts in law, policy, medicine, and other fields as they craft legislation. ADF Senior Vice President of Communications Greg Scott said in a statement, that's a normal part of a healthy democracy. Yes, of course, if you make up your own experts, it's a little less healthy. Privately, John Euler, I'm guessing is the pronunciation of his last name, a therapist who supports conversion therapy, urged the working group to respond to questions for this article by emphasizing that there is no such thing as a trans kid. He later sent me a series of social media posts comparing trans people and drag performers, let's just throw them in there as well, to sexual predators, which is weird because the governor of Tennessee is one of them, I guess. So, but that was just fun drag, not the bad kind. Sure. The emails illustrate just how long some major figures in the anti-trans movement have been incubating political attacks on transgender healthcare. For instance, Broyles, who today represents Jamie Reed, the former caseworker who has made controversial, high-profile claims against a Missouri gender clinic, was working in 2020 with ACPED's executive director, Michelle Cretella, and retired American Principles Project senior fellow Jane Robbins to compile a packet of lobbying materials in support of Vulnerable Child Protection Act bills, including a guide targeted at parents. Please share these with your legislators and feel free to, disseminate them as widely as possible with allies. Broyles wrote on January 9th, 2020, we hope they become weapons in the hands of many warriors. Hooray. The 2019 bill wasn't Deutsch's first time pushing anti-trans legislation or his first time working with Alliance Defending Freedom. A retired chiropractor and former president of the anti-abortion group South Dakota Right to Life, Deutsch was elected to the State House in 2014 and 2 years later introduced one of the earliest bathroom bills. Remember those? Based on ADF model legislation, that's the business that Alec is in, model legislation. So the comparison is apt. Like North Carolina's infamous HB 2, the proposal attempted to block trans students from using school restrooms and locker rooms that matched their gender identity. It passed both houses of the state legislature before it was vetoed by then Governor Dennis Daugaard, who said that the bill, quote, does not address any pressing issue concerning the school districts of South Dakota. There were no problems with it at that point. According to University of Cincinnati law professor Ryan Thoresen, a former LGBT rights program researcher for Human Rights Watch, Deutsch was one of the most prominent state lawmakers nationally in pushing anti-transgender restrictions at the state level, even before we were seeing these huge waves of bills. Deutsch, by the way, declined to answer any questions for this story. In 2019, Deutsch tweeted that he would try to criminalize doctors who followed the Endocrine Society's clinical practice guidelines for treating people with gender dysphoria. He would later claim the idea for such a law had come from children I saw on Twitter. Okay, why are you following children on Twitter? I don't know. Who told him to read Reddit forums about detransitioning. By that summer, Deutsch had quietly assembled a group of advisors, including people who had once identified as trans, only to reverse course and deny that anyone is truly transgender. They helped him workshop legislative language, supporting materials, and proponent testimony. It was like Deutsch assembled a team of Navy SEALs. We were all trained killers in a specialty. I don't know. I mean, it's a little weird comparison to make, but okay. A little glorifying of what Navy SEALs do is exciting and fun, and your boring ass crap really isn't anything like that, but whatever you got to tell yourself to get out of bed in the morning, I guess. Who tells themselves this? Elisa Ray Shoup, a retired U.S. Army soldier who, why she didn't pick Green Berets rather than Navy SEALs, I'll never know. But she's got an identity crisis going on right there. A retired U.S. Army soldier who thinks she's a Navy SEAL. Weird. Anyway, she has become a vocal anti-trans advocate and participated in Deutsch's working group after detransitioning. Shoup has since retransitioned, disavowed much of her old activism, and shared her copies of the working group's emails with reporters. Well, okay, that is interesting. I guess she is having a bit of an identity crisis, or has been through several of them in the past. Okay, back when she was on their side, she was a retired U.S. Army soldier who thought she was a Navy SEAL. Now it turns out this is somebody who was a transgender woman who then changed her mind, began detransitioning, joined this group to help them attack transgender people by saying, I was transgender and I changed my mind and what a tragedy it is. And then later said, you know what, actually I was right the first time. I'm going to continue with my transition, quit the group, and then said, to her credit, everybody should see what's going on behind the scenes here. How interesting is that? Religious right rhetoric about wanting to help children with gender dysphoria is, she says, just a front for what they do behind the scenes. It's like they want to do as much damage to the trans community as they can. And by the way, in some cases, they also want to do damage to them one at a time by actually abusing them, and then insisting that I was just trying to help you figure out your gender identity. That's a little weird, too. We'll get to that later on, perhaps in another story. The draft bill Deutsch sent the group in August of 2019 sparked a lengthy debate over language. In one email chain, participants struggled to narrow the wording of Deutsch's bill to avoid blocking treatments for trauma victims or legitimizing the concept of gender as one separate from biological sex. Catherine Cave, a founder of the anti-trans parent organization Kelsey Coalition, suggested specifying that treatments were only banned for patients who had an, quote, incorrect perception of their sex. It's getting a little confusing here. A child and parental rights campaign lawyer proposed replacing the word incorrect with dissonant. And it's interesting, though, the internal battles over the wording never indicates to them at any point that maybe they just don't really have a firm grasp of what they're doing or what they're dealing with. They're certain they're right. They can't come up with any words for it. But, to me, it's an indication that you got some more work to do. But not to them. They're certain they're right. Richard Mast of Liberty Counsel separately advised the group to avoid saying the words transgender, cisgender, or non-binary. Using them surrenders the language, Mast wrote. What an extremist he is. If the other side's language frames the debate, we lose. Members of the South Dakota team, as they occasionally refer to themselves, hammered out talking points for upcoming bill hearings, where a detransitioner and a member of the Women's Liberation Front would testify in favor of the bill, along with doctors from both inside and outside South Dakota. I'm not familiar with the Women's Liberation Front, but I bet there's something to unpack there. The group debated how to respond to the ACLU's claim that their bill was unconstitutional. How should we answer that? While there may be a constitutional right to refuse to carry a child to term under Roe, there is no constitutional right to chemically and surgically mutilating one's healthy body where there is no disease to be treated. That is child abuse, Broyles wrote. But if you're treating your own healthy body, that's not self-abuse in the strict sense, but the traditionally used sense. But it's also, it very much is there. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting that people would claim you don't have any right to do that to yourself, but you do have the right to eat horse paste, shine a light bulb, who knows where. There's all sorts of interesting places you can shine light bulbs these days. Drink a fish tank, whatever it might be. Drink unpasteurized raw milk, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things they want, and so they're supposed to have the freedom to do. These things that you, weird people that we don't like, want, well, we can't have any of that. Well, the team further brainstormed responses to the argument that gender-affirming care reduces suicide. They had to try to address that, too. We need to find a way to be pro-suicide. How can we do it? An assertion that is, of course, backed up by research, but peer-reviewed studies have repeatedly found, as we said, that trans and non-binary youth with access to gender-affirming care are significantly less likely to seriously consider suicide than those who did not receive such care. A larger analysis using online survey data from over 11,000 trans and non-binary youth found using gender-affirming hormonal therapy was associated with lower rates of both depression and suicidality. Not a word I use every day. Yet, one team member called the argument that gender-affirming care helps abusive. Weird.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with the reading of the article here in Mother Jones about the behind-the-scenes-ish network of people pushing these various anti-transgender bills in so many states across the country. As we were exiting to the break, we were recounting the fact that numerous medical studies and fairly large studies at that had concluded fairly convincingly that the availability of gender-affirming care helps to reduce depression and suicidality in teens and young adults. Yet one team member of the anti-trans bill team, is what we're talking about here, called the argument that gender-affirming care reduces suicide abusive. How so? Not sure entirely, but this helps maybe shed a little light on it. Another argued that it was actually a way for doctors to coerce parents into consenting to gender-affirming care for their child. If you don't do this, your child will face these problems with depression and suicidality. And they may say that may be the case, although very often by the time the parents are talking to doctors about this, it's usually because they say, well, in addition to expressing a different gender identity, my child seems depressed and I'm worried, or has outright made suicidal threats, and we're here to try and address that. But I could certainly imagine that there would be a situation where that's not part of the equation, and a doctor might say there might even be mental health benefits to pursuing this course, even though there may not have been any indication of mental issues at that point, but they don't always express it. I don't know. Very odd. But you can see how they can find a way to worm their argument into it. What's really happening here is doctors are lining their pockets from all of this care, so they tell the parents that unless you pay me for my care, your child will want to commit suicide. I doubt that that's being presented up front and in the way that they intimate here. But back to the article. Van Mall, the doctor who's part of this team, suggested that Deutsch reply to the suicide prevention argument with a rebuttal published on a defunct anti-trans blog. Why not go with defunct blogs rather than medical science published in journals, right? Why weren't the 1950s a total bloodbath for suicides if non-affirmation of everything is the fast train to offing one's self? Van Mall asked, paraphrasing the blog post. Boy, that was paraphrasing of the blog post. The blog post was even worse than that, maybe. I don't know, unless Van Mall is the worst writer of the two. But super well-reasoned, right? Why weren't the 1950s a total bloodbath for suicides? Well, you know, I mean, are we saying people weren't committing suicide in the 1950s? Because they were, but they very frequently disguised that outcome in the, you know, in whatever records would be left behind for anybody to study this, which I don't think that they've availed themselves of either, the records. It's just an assumption. I don't know. In the movies, it's not a lot of stuff. So the end. I don't know. They're not basing it on anything in particular. Another doctor in the working group, California endocrinologist Michael Laidlaw, had gained attention for his writing against gender-affirming care after parents at a charter school in his region raised complaints that they hadn't been notified before kindergartners were read a children's book, I Am Jazz, about a trans teenager named Jazz Jennings. Last fall, when the state of Florida called on Laidlaw as an expert witness in a lawsuit over its anti-trans Medicaid policy, a federal judge concluded that he was far off from the accepted view on how to treat gender dysphoria, in part because Laidlaw had said he would refuse to use patients' preferred pronouns. In his South Dakota testimony, Laidlaw compared gender-affirming care to Nazi experimentation and the Tuskegee syphilis study, which I'm sure he would have stepped in to help with. Okay. In emails to Deutsch and the group, he railed against doctors who prescribe puberty blockers, which are used to delay unwanted physical changes in gender-diverse kids and give them more time to explore whether or how to transition, accusing them of willfully harming children, even if kids and their parents consent to treatment. The physician is the criminal in these scenarios and must be prosecuted by the law, he argued, and of course they would say, but not if they give fish tank medicine or horse paste to their patients. They're just brave explorers. Around the time it became clear that Deutsch's bill would not pass, the discussions on the email threads shifted from strategy to impassioned proclamations that trans people don't exist. Well, if we can't win, then we can just redefine them out of existence and win that way, I guess. The state is forcing people to participate in a lie akin to 2 + 2 = 5. Cretella wrote, a man is not a woman. If this is not the definition of insane, I don't know what is. Some participants in the chains argued over whether it undermined their cause to work with a trans activist who opposed medical transition for children, but not for adults. Interesting. Their endorsements come with a hitch. They expect everyone to play make-believe that they really are the opposite sex and have compelled pronouns and all that garbage, Shoup wrote. In spring of 2020, the group claimed one victory. MAST of Liberty Counsel put the team in touch with Idaho Representative Julianne Young, who was working on a bill to prohibit trans people from changing the gender marker on their birth certificate. Young, who had taken edits from ADF attorney Matt Sharp on the proposal, asked the group for feedback on its language and invited them to edit her press release about it. In response to questions from Mother Jones, Young said that consulting with experts with legislation is a normal part of our robust democratic process. And I think we actually have seen that excuse before inside of this article. And, you know, it's okay to consult with others, even others outside of your state. That's true. It's a little odd that you can't find support within your own state or within your own staff for that. But, and it's also a little odd, the sorts of people you consider to be experts in anything, but, okay. On March 30th, 2020, Young wrote to the group with excitement to announce that her bill had been signed by Idaho Governor Little. "I can't thank you enough for your help and support," she wrote. "Thanks for staying so focused on this, even through the endless pandemic pandemonium," replied Gary McCaleb, a lawyer on ADF's appellate team. "Very, very well done." Even as Deutsch's original bill failed, variations of the Vulnerable Child Protection Act were already being introduced in at least 9 states beyond South Dakota. In part, that was thanks to the efforts of people on the team who were pushing the bill they'd workshopped with Deutsch behind the scenes to other Republican legislators. In October of 2019, Broyles announced to the group that she and Robbins had met with Georgia State Representative Ginny Earhart and converted her to their cause. I thought they were anti-conversion. Anyway, she is filing our bill this legislative session, Broyles wrote. "Am stoked," wow, stoked, like the kids say, "for what God is doing in Georgia," but also our emails. Not long after their meeting, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported Earhart as saying she had drafted the bill in response to a high-profile child custody dispute in Texas, in which parents disagreed about their child's gender identity. In Florida, an aide for State Representative Anthony Sabatini contacted MAST for recommendations for experts who could speak out in support of a Vulnerable Child Protection Act there. Cortella helped collect names of like-minded doctors and psychologists, reporting to the group that she'd urged a lobbyist to get a diversity of witnesses. Diversity. You're against that. To get a diversity of witnesses as was achieved for South Dakota. Meanwhile, Eagle Forum worked with a Utah lawmaker, then Representative Brad Daw, who'd agreed to sponsor a similar bill in his state. "We've got lots of legislators working on this," a Utah Eagle Forum activist told the Salt Lake Tribune. Deutsch told his group he would pass workshopped legislative language and supporting materials to Daw through Eagle Forum. But Daw, citing pushback from colleagues and the parents of trans children, later changed his mind and instead filed a bill to study the effects of puberty blockers. Interesting. I was distracted in reading through this, of thinking about the Eagle Forum and the role it used to play here, just in case you were wondering whether, reform or change can come to some of these places or not. But I've told you the story. You all know how often we've discussed what's going on here in Loudoun County, Virginia, and what Republicans wish was going on in Loudoun County versus what's actually going on, which is that it has trended strongly toward the Democratic camp for a long time now. But when I first arrived here, one of the members of the Board of Supervisors was Phyllis Schlafly's closest aide, I think, at the time at the Eagle Forum. This county now, derided as the most woke and diversity training CRT kook, so we got to put a stop to it. And of course, it's nothing like that whatsoever. But it's also not trending Republican. But when I got here, it was that red that we had anti-gay activists on the board like Eugene Delgado, and we had Eagle Forum people like, what was her name? Lori Waters. Yeah. And, it's been a while since I've been here. It's nearly 30 years later, but even now, even in the face of all of these concentrated attacks from Glenn Youngkin, etc., who based his whole campaign on fighting against Loudoun County wokeness, we still remain a Democratic county and have been for a while and look to be in the future as well. So just pointing that out. And Alabama, according to an email from Eagle Forum's Clark, both Cretella and Deutsch had coached her as she led legislators in the state to adopt a bill similar to Fred Deutsch's. The resulting legislation, dubbed the Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act, throwing compassion in there as well, failed in 2020 and the following year, but an updated version was signed into law in 2022, becoming the country's second ban on gender-affirming care and the first to criminalize doctors who provided it. The first, in Arkansas, was passed in 2021. Today, 6 states in total have banned gender-affirming medication and surgical care for minors. After Alabama enacted its version of Deutsch's bill, The Justice Department sued the state, arguing that the law is unconstitutional because it discriminates based on sex and transgender status. A federal judge agreed to block parts of the new law, explaining that Alabama had produced no credible evidence to back up its claims that the medications are experimental. The uncontradicted evidence is that at least 22 major medical associations in the United States endorse transitioning medications as well-established, evidence-based treatments for gender dysphoria in minors. District Court Judge Lyles Burke wrote in his order issuing a temporary injunction. That case, along with the challenge to the Arkansas ban, is still playing out in court. Last fall, Burke denied a Justice Department attempt to subpoena the Eagle Forum for all documents related to its advocacy for the law. Eagle Forum of Alabama took on this issue after hearing from citizens in Alabama, including parents, doctors, lawyers, and guidance counselors about their concerns for otherwise healthy children who wanted to transition to the opposite sex, the group claimed in a 2023 press release. And in South Dakota, Deutsch finally won the long battle this February when Governor Kristi Noem, of course, signed an updated version of his bill. The new law strips licenses from doctors who provide minors with gender-affirming care and requires healthcare providers to gradually cut off puberty blockers and hormones for any kids they are already treating. Sounds like they probably wanted to ban them outright from the get-go, but someone convinced them, I'd be curious to know how they did it, that, that would be even more dangerous, and we can perhaps mandate that they be weaned off of the medication, but you can't just stop. And the fact that they believed that and allowed for that is kind of remarkable all by itself, worthy of some investigation. That provision is expected to force some South Dakota teens to medically detransition by the end of 2023. Deutsch turned to Twitter in February to celebrate the signing of the South Dakota ban. "This concludes the effort I began 3 years ago," he tweeted, along with a picture of lawmakers toasting. "Many good people have worked to protect," in his view, protect our children. Okay, a little worrisome, a little scary. But not the only organizing going on in this space. As I mentioned, the Washington Post has a very different group of organizing principles and both spellings of the word, I guess, and both meanings represented here. The fear and fury of these Florida parents. Which ones? Well, these. They're listed here by Caitlin Gibson, writing for the Post. The subheader says the state has introduced new laws, Florida, of course, that affect nearly every stage of parenting. Some families are choosing, though, between fight and flight. And it's not clear that there's any one answer for everybody. No surprise, of course. One afternoon a few weeks ago, Alicia Hotchkiss's 14-year-old son, Eli, came home from his high school in Tampa with a question about something a classmate had said to him. He'd heard the student use the word gay as an insult, as sometimes does happen among kids. So Eli responded the way he always does when this happens. "Hey," Eli said, "my dad's gay." But this time, Eli told his mom the other kid offered a startling rebuke. "You're not allowed to say that at school." And you can see where that came from, right? In a nearby community in Central Florida, Barbara Mellon attended a recent open house at her son's elementary school and asked her child's teacher to suggest a few titles or authors that might help her second grader develop more interest in reading. The teacher looked anxious, she says, and told her he couldn't recommend any books. Yikes. "Oh, my child is interested I'm trying to help develop an interest in reading in my child. You got any books I could use? You got any suggestions?" No, they're so afraid that they'll be, stripped of their licenses or prosecuted for recommending the wrong book. I think Green Eggs and Ham is okay, but you never know. The ham lobby, I got no idea what kind of power they wield in Tallahassee. I'm a little afraid of it. Wow. In the Facebook group Brittany Minor created 5 years ago for black mothers like herself in Orlando, discussions among the 2,800 members have reached new depths of frustration and fatigue. These moms are watching what is happening in Florida, the shifting of the political and cultural environment around them, and they are tired. They feel helpless. They feel hopeless, Miner says. The common thread is that people feel broken. And that is dangerous and worrisome because, of course, it's one of the indicators that, fascism is winning. That's one of the goals, is to break these people's spirits. Everybody's spirits, really, so they can get out of the way for the fascist government. Anyway, adding to the members' sense of distress and disorientation, Miner says, is the knowledge that so many of their neighbors supported the state's pivot from purple to solid red. Under Governor Ron DeSantis, who won re-election in a 20-point landslide in November and is poised for a potential presidential run, Florida has become the center of gravity for conservative policymaking, as James Nash of the bipartisan ROKK Solutions public affairs strategy firm has previously told the Washington Post. Florida families are now facing a slew of new laws and policy proposals that touch nearly every stage of parenting, from the reproductive health care a pregnant mother can receive to the books available for an elementary school student to read, to the diversity and social culture awaiting students on college campuses. The effects are already far-reaching. The Parental Rights in Education Act, widely referred to by critics as Don't Say Gay, and that just harkens back to the problem Eli was having. And I guess I would have to admit here, remember, it's the critics of the bill who say it's the Don't Say Gay bill, and the supporters of the bill say that's not what it says, or that's not what you should call it. But kids come away from seeing the Don't Say Gay label hung on it as thinking it means you're literally not allowed to say, that students aren't allowed to say the word gay to one another in school, which is not actually what the bill says, but is probably attributable to the name that opponents hung on it. So I suppose it's the opponents who we support, but who are perhaps somewhat at fault for this misinterpretation. But then again, the same kid had just said gay, so I don't know. I guess reason was not a part of this, right? Hey, my father's gay. Hey, you're not allowed to say that in school. Well, you're not allowed to say gay either. You just said it, and so stop. And if logic had anything to do with it, I don't know what would happen here. Anyway, the effects are already far-reaching. As we said, Parental Rights and Education Act, widely referred to by critics as Don't Say Gay, prohibits educators, not kids, but educators in kindergarten through third grade from addressing gender or sexual orientation in class, and restricts what teachers in upper grades can say on the topic. Then, as I mentioned to you, the Stop Woke Act, which actually stands for the Stop Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act. That's a terrible acronym. Bars the teaching of critical race theory, the academic framework for examining systemic racism that has garnered so much attention lately. Books for students of all ages have been removed from public school media centers and classroom libraries after a new state law mandated that all material made available to students be age appropriate, free of, quote, pornography, and, quote, suited to student needs, without providing any clear guidelines about how those standards are to be applied. Just before the start of Florida's legislative session this week, GOP lawmakers introduced a slate of new bills that would further overhaul both K through 12 and higher education, expanding the limitations on teaching gender or sexual identity through 8th grade, and requiring teachers to use pronouns that match a child's sex assigned at birth, among other proposals. Beyond the public school system, Florida has moved on several fronts. Its medical boards have imposed rules barring transgender children from receiving gender-affirming medical care. Guess where that came from. On abortion, state law now prohibits the procedure beyond 15 weeks gestation, with few exceptions. And a new bill would tighten that restriction to 6 weeks. And on guns, lawmakers are pushing for legislation that would allow Florida residents to carry firearms without a state license. At the center of all of this are families trying to navigate the transforming legal landscape of their home state. Parents who do not support these measures describe feeling both fearful and furious. Some of them have embraced activism for the first time. while longtime advocates have grown more outspoken. Others are just trying to manage what this new reality means for their families and futures. When Eli wanted to know why his classmates said he couldn't talk about his father at school, Hotchkiss, a mom of 3 boys who shares custody of the older 2 with her ex-husband, sat her son down and reiterated that there is nothing wrong with saying gay. But, she told him, a new law in their state means that if teachers talk about sexual orientation in certain ways, they can get in trouble. She had discussed this with her sons before, she says, but now Eli was experiencing the reverberations of the law for himself, and he stared at her, confounded. But why? He kept asking. And the answer is, because some gimmitarians said that's what they want, and that they had the numbers, and the logic didn't matter to them. For families like these in Florida, the difficult questions keep coming. How can we allow my kids to be proud of their family if they can't speak about who I am? Asks Kaylin Jones, a non-binary parent with 2 preschool-aged children who refer to Jones as their baba rather than mom or dad. A lot of black moms are saying, well, we teach our kids about black history at home anyway. But what about kids who aren't being taught black history at home? Minor says. Good question. If I leave Florida, then who am I leaving behind? Says Angela Wynn, the mom of a 10-year-old daughter in Sarasota and co-founder of the statewide advocacy group Support Our Schools. If we go, who is left to fight? That is a good question. And by the way, I thought a good question from Kaylin Jones, the non-binary parent, right up at the top of this section. How can I allow my kids to be proud of their family if they can't speak about who I am? And remember that they were banning CRT because it was making it impossible for, in their view, white children to be proud of themselves and their own race and their own families, and it was instead making them sad and depressed about being white. And that was so important that be prevented from happening, that they were going to ban not only the discussion of CRT, which wasn't being discussed, but also black history itself, and eliminate the AP black history course in order to prevent anything like that from happening. Don't make white children depressed, in our view, about being white, but you can certainly make the families of where children are parented by a non-binary parent feel sad, isolated, and embarrassed about themselves. That's okay. Good stuff for us, bad stuff for you. That's the gimmitarian way. What's happening in Florida has made fighters of parents who did not expect to be at the center of such high-stakes political battles and rallied some who never before considered their politics to be particularly progressive. Seth Stottlemyre, the father of a 5-year-old daughter in Sarasota, has always described himself and his wife as political moderates. They're both registered under no party affiliation, he says. His wife is a former Republican, and they have friends, neighbors, and business associates from across the political spectrum, but their daughter is starting kindergarten this fall, and Stottlemyre is increasingly concerned about what's happening to the public school system that awaits her. He's become more vocal about his views, connecting with other parents who feel the same. He's started writing letters to the editor of the local paper, putting his opposition to DeSantis' laws on record. What sort of future would you expect for your kids starting kindergarten in a state where there are no books on the shelves in classrooms because teachers are afraid to give them to kids, and they can't even recommend anything for them to read at home? Not a great place to do this. It feels like there are certain elements that are trying to turn the clock back in America and turn the clock back on our state. The banning of books is a big concern for us, Stottlemyre says, as is the whitewashing of American history. He's also distressed by the targeting of LGBTQ children. As a parent, and especially one with a 5-year-old, I just don't know what path my daughter's life is going to take, and it's scary to think that there are people who are wanting to try to marginalize her. In her life before the pandemic, Wynn, the co-founder of Support Our Schools, a nonprofit that advocates for children to receive a safe, inclusive, and fact-based public education, had made a point to avoid political activism. Politics felt like such a beast, this machine, and I felt I couldn't do anything about it, she says. So I tried not to get involved. But when DeSantis took aim at mask mandates in public schools before her young children were eligible for vaccines, Wynne started going to school board meetings to push for continued safety measures. She was astonished by the hostility she witnessed there, the anti-mask activists who would spit or sneeze on her after she spoke, which is assault and you should be arrested for it. She kept going anyway and met other like-minded parents. We started to realize that this wasn't just about masks. Lo and behold, huh? It was just the topic of the hour. Then it morphed into targeting critical race theory. And then it morphed into targeting social emotional learning, she says. So she and others co-founded Support Our Schools, one of several parent-led organizations that have emerged to counter the rise of conservative groups like Moms for Liberty, which launched in Brevard County with the aim of supporting, quote, parental rights, and has since spread nationwide, like the pandemic itself. Once I started going to those meetings, my eyes were forced open, Wynne says, and now I can't keep quiet. Now I can't back down. Not with my daughter here. We're a little late on the music, but let's read a little bit more before we give up for the day here. That same determination drives Denise Mestanza Taylor, a public educator turned homeschooling parent, who talks openly with her kids about the controversies consuming the public school system. The topic we just talked about was the state tracking the menstrual cycle for athletes, she says, referring to a recently abandoned proposal that would have required student athletes to answer questions about their menstrual history. Mestanza Taylor says her 17-year-old, who is non-binary, was outraged by the suggestion that students would have to provide such personal information to school officials. She was proud of her child's reaction. These Gen Z kids are going to be the ones to really push back on all this nonsense, she says. Well, I hope so. There's plenty more to the article. Unfortunately, I don't have as much time. I wish I had now much time for the people organizing against this insanity as we had to give over to the people who were organizing for it. But I suppose first know your enemy and then find your allies and friends and stand with them where you can, and especially in Florida, before we find Ron DeSantis pitching his effort to make America Florida, which is a horrific thought, and I guess he thinks it's a winner of a slogan, though. Anyway, time now for us to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, coming up next right here on NetworksRadio.com. Oh dear.
You've been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Well, it's another one of those days where we're all discombobulated, and Justice has, I guess, probably typed out a full description of what he's got on tap for you in his show, but forgotten to press the enter button so that it would send to me via Skype. But I can promise you this, as I promise you every time, the show will be exciting and refreshing, and stay tuned, and we'll see you tomorrow.